All right, everybody, if you'll take a seat, please. All right, so everyone, I have the pleasure of a new family member of the Southern campaigns of the American Revolution. I just met him, Damon Fordham. Am I saying that right?
You're saying it right.
And his bio's in there. The point I want to bring out now is the last two speakers, Damon and one more to come, are actually professional historians. And I guess we got to count Steve Smith too, because he's an archaeologist who's paid. So these are the real people who are making a living, actually teaching and helping to bring up the next generation. I always ask what's something different, and in fact, I got a real good inside scoop, but I'm not allowed to say a few things that he's very talented. But two of them are that he plays the melodica. He picked it up during the pandemic, which is a really neat little instrument, and maybe we can get him to get it out of the car or something. And he also does a walking tour, which is called the Lost Stories of Black Charleston. So the Lost Stories of Black Charleston are something we're going to have to get to, and it's amazing. But let me ask the question for basics. So where do we know, as already mentioned earlier today, where some blacks came from to serve in our Southern campaigns? What country? Come on, it was said earlier this morning. What's the country where blacks came from to help serve in that Southern campaigns? I can't believe this. We're not paying attention to the speakers. You got a hard Haiti. Interestingly enough, a Haitian who would then be moved to the northeast and then to the northwest, whose name is, I had to do up something for you, is DuSable. He will fight with, he's a Haitian, he's only 25 years old. He'll fight with George Rogers Clark in the West and help defeat the British there. And then he is actually, this blew my mind, sir, you have to
I know the story. Go ahead.
He actually founded the trading post, which is the founding of Chicago.
That's right.
By a Haitian black, which is great. So without further ado, Damon Fordham, let's give him a mic. Hey, Ben.
As a matter of fact, there's also a DuSable High School in Chicago. It's named after Jean-Baptiste DuSable. It's the alma mater of Nat King Cole, Red Fox, and many other celebrities from the Chicago region, as well as John Johnson, the founder of Ebony Magazine, which is the magazine as a boy. I learned a lot of these stories, so that's pretty good that you tie that all in. Now, regarding the blacks in the American Revolution. Now, that's a story that I found that's not known even by a lot of people who specialize in this. A couple of years ago, I gave a talk where, I believe it was in Canada, if I'm not mistaken, where I mentioned that the first person to die for the freedom of what we now know as the United States was a man named Crispus Attucks from Barbados. He had run away from slavery in Massachusetts. And what? Hold it. Yep, I know some of you are like, wait, slavery in Massachusetts? Yes, slavery existed in the North until 1827. And how it ended in the North will be at the tail end of what I'm going to talk about. Anyway, Crispus ran away around 1752 or so. He was born in Barbados. And he worked on ships as a free man. And then during the March of 1770, he was a group of friends of his, when some British soldiers arrested an American, and the Americans felt that he was being treated unfairly. So they were yelling, "Get out of here, you lobster backs," referring to the redcoats, of course. They started throwing snowballs with rocks in them at the lobster backs, and the lobster backs picked up their rifles and fired. And it is widely believed that Crispus Attucks was the very first to lose his life that day, and there's a statue in Boston Commons that mentions Crispus Attucks among them. But in spite of that, there was initial reluctance to have black soldiers when the American Revolution came along. Why? For a very simple reason. Many of the men who were among the founding fathers, especially in the Southland, were slave owners. And if you gave your slave a gun, who's he going to shoot? All right? So they were like, oh, no, we're not having that. But a couple of things happened that turned the tide. One is the story of a man by the name of James Lafayette, who I will tell momentarily. But one important thing with all of this was what happened whenever you're at war with an enemy. The thing that the enemy must do is to find your Achilles heel. What is the weakness that we could exploit? So along comes James Murray, who was the Royal Lord Governor of Virginia, 1775, who was known better as Lord Dunmore. So he said, okay, so the Americans don't want black people fighting in their army. I know what I'll do. He declared a proclamation that said, in the language of that time, that all Negroes who were wishing for their freedom could come and join what he called the Ethiopian Regiment, which is an army in Ethiopia. In those days, they used that as a generic term for Africa. And so, therefore, they came by the thousands off the plantations to join up with the British. So they met against the Americans with the Battle of Kemp's Landing in Virginia. And they were fighting Colonel Joseph Hutchins on the American side. And this was the scene, an approximation of what happened shortly afterwards. General Washington. Yes, come in. What is it? General Washington, I have terrible tidings for you. Oh, really? What is it? General, we have lost the Battle of Kemp's Landing. What? Oh, my goodness, that's terrible. General Washington, it's even worse than that. How could it be worse? General, we have lost to a regiment of Negroes. What? Oh, my goodness. Not only that, do you know who they kept? Do you know what else happened? No, what else happened? Colonel Hutchins was captured. He was? Yes, by one of his own slaves. Oh, my goodness. Oh, this is terrible. It's terrible. General, the worst is yet to come. How could it be any worse? General, guess who joined up with this Ethiopian regiment? Who? Some of your own slaves from Mount Vernon. Oh! That, ladies and gentlemen, is what led to the recruiting of black patriots during the American Revolution. One such man was William Billy Lee, who in fact was owned by George Washington. And he assisted General Washington in numerous battles during the American Revolution. And I'm sure that some of you heard the story about how General Washington freed his enslaved people upon his death, right? Well, see, William Billy Lee was the first that he officially named as such to be freed immediately upon his death. The others were owned by Martha, who would be freed upon her death. Okay? So while all this is going on, you also had James Lafayette. James Lafayette was part of the Battle of Bunker Hill, as a matter of fact. And he would also go on to spy against Benedict Arnold, among other things, and would serve in various loyalist camps, pretending to be this illiterate enslaved person and taking messages back to the Patriots. And he became friendly with the Marquis de Lafayette. And he was basically his right-hand man as Lafayette was assisting us during the American Revolution. So much so that because of Lafayette's service, after the war, he petitioned the Virginia legislature for his freedom, and in 1787, he was among those who received his freedom. And many years later, when Lafayette toured America, James Lafayette was milling around as this was happening, and so the Marquis de Lafayette stopped the parade for him and insisted that he go out and greet James Lafayette for his service. So James Lafayette was the first African-American soldier to be honored, to be greatly honored for his service, and was one of those who was freed for his service in the American Revolution. Now, I told you about this Ethiopian regiment, right? Well, one such person was Colonel Tai, and the colonel was just an honorary title for him. He went around, he was a loyalist who went on sharpshooting missions for the British, fighting largely in New Jersey until he was shot in the leg and died of gangrene early in the war. But one really interesting person in all this was a man named Boston King. Boston King was born in what we would now call Summerville, South Carolina. And he was also the first black South Carolinian to write his autobiography in 1798. And he tells of how badly mistreated he was during slavery until he ran away to Charleston, and he wound up in Charleston in 1780. And guess what was happening in Charleston in 1780? British occupation. So he decided to cast his lot with the British, figuring that that would give him his freedom. And it turned out that he did. He learned to read and write and became a minister. But then, Houston, we had a little problem here. You see, the Lord Dunmore promised all black men who fought for the Loyalist cause that they would get their freedom when the British won the war. The British didn't win the war. However, they made arrangements for a lot of these men to go in a place called Birchtown up in Nova Scotia and several other cities in that region. However, they had another problem. Rumors spread among the whites up there that these black people would come there and work cheap and take their jobs. Sound kind of familiar, doesn't it? And so, therefore, that wasn't working out. So people like Boston King demanded of King George, Your Majesty, we have fought, bled, and died for the crown of England, and yet we're treated as if we were still slaves who did nothing for the empire. Can you not do better than this by these people? So King George said, well, I see what I can do here. We have some land down in Sierra Leone in West Africa, so that you can go back there and live in freedom. So it is written, so it is done, God save the king, and so forth. So they set up a colony down in Sierra Leone for these newly freed people who had fought for the British Army, and so since Sierra Leone was a British colony, a lot of them literally went back to Africa, and Boston King became a minister and missionary before he died in the early 1800s. And before he died, he wrote his autobiography in 1798, where he detailed these experiences. Now, some other people who are worthy of mentioning this, let's take this down on a South Carolina level. Now, I was born in Spartanburg, and one story I've always found interesting was the story of Colin. Who's Colin, you may ask? Well, now, up near Spartanburg, you have what's known as the Battle of Cowpens, okay, fought by the Spartan Guards, who, of course, that's how the town of Spartanburg got its name. And Colin was an interesting person. He was born in about 1767, and he worked as a servant for Lieutenant Colonel William Washington of the 3rd Continental Light Dragoons. And so during the Battle of Cowpens, January 17, 1781, there was an interesting incident that happened there. You see, it mentioned that Lieutenant Colonel Washington had given orders to his men not to fire a pistol. So they got in pursuit of the British cavalry, and he got ahead of his men perhaps by 30 yards. And 3 of the British officers observed this, and they wheeled around and made a charge at Lieutenant Colonel William Washington. So the officer on his right hand was raising his arm to actually stab Colonel Washington with his knife. However, Colin just happened to have a pistol on him, and he pulled out his pistol and shot the British man, saving William Washington's life at the Battle of Cowpens in 1791. Very little known fact about American history. And that was chronicled by one of your own, a gentleman by the name of Michael Scroggins, who some of you might remember, who did a lot of writing about the American Revolution. Now, there was, of course, also, since we're here talking largely about Francis Marion, I can, of course, not mention the story of Oscar. Oscar Marion, who was owned by General Francis Marion, who had fought along his side at the Siege of Savannah, as well as the Siege of the Charleston, as well as the Battle of Eutaw Springs. What is little known about Oscar was that not only the tragic fact that he was never freed in spite of his efforts as far as we know, but a living cousin of his went to President George W. Bush with the story and managed to get a Medal of Honor recognition by President George W. Bush in 2006 to commemorate his heroism and sacrifice. Another such soldier was Peter Salem of Massachusetts, who served at the Battle of Bunker Hill after he was freed to serve with the militia. And a marker exists for him in Farmington, Massachusetts, that was built in 1882. Now, along with all of these interesting things, I have to mention an important role that a couple of women played in all of this. Now, I just mentioned earlier that Boston King was the first African American to write his autobiography. Well, he was actually the first African American man that we know of who wrote like that. The first African American woman to have her work published as a book was a lady by the name of Phyllis Wheatley. And Phyllis Wheatley, for those of you who don't know, she was born in Africa around 1753. Around the age of 7, she was captured on the West Coast, but instead of going south, the ship went to Massachusetts, where she was owned by a family named Wheatley. And the Wheatleys, she was not one of these plantation slaves picking cotton in the hot fields or anything like that. She was basically a house servant, as many in the North were in those days. And the Wheatleys taught her how to read, not just English, but also Latin. And she became quite fond of the classics and began to write and publish poetry. And so she wrote her first book of poetry around 1770 or so, but the times were such that she had to get sworn affidavits by prominent white men in her community that this was no hoax, that she really wrote this book herself. Now, it's important that I mention that literacy, even among white Americans, was rare in those days. So it was doubly rare for African Americans at that time, because, of course, if you teach a man or a woman to read and write, they will know that there is more to their lives than in slavery, as Frederick Douglass would greatly demonstrate in the next century. So anyway, she was very much caught up in the patriot cause, and she was moved by George Washington's heroics early in the war. So in 1775, she wrote a letter to George Washington that says as follows: "Dear Sir, I have taken the freedom to address your excellency in the enclosed poem and entreat your acceptance, though I am not insensible to its inaccuracies. Your being appointed the Grand Continental Congress to be Generalissimo of the armies of North America, together with the fame of your virtues, excites sensations not easy to suppress. Your generosity, therefore, I presume, will pardon the attempt. Wishing your excellency all possible success in the great cause you are so generously engaged in, I am sincerely yours, Phyllis Wheatley." And I'll just give you a couple of verses of this. "Celestial choir enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write, while freedom's cause her anxious breast alarms. She flashes dreadful in refulgent arms. See Mother Earth her offspring's fate bemoan, and nations gaze at seas before unknown. See the bright beams of heaven's revolving light, involved in sorrows in the veil of night." And goes on to say, "Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. a crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington be thine. Well, George Washington liked the poem. And he wrote her back saying that he would have publicized it, otherwise it would have been immodest. He felt it would have been immodest if he publicized it. But he said that he was greatly honored to hear from someone who has been so greatly gifted by the muses. That was his word. And he invited her, and he actually invited her on a courtesy call to Mount Vernon. And he did. Okay? So that would make Phyllis Wheatley the very first person of African descent to meet with the head of state of what would become the United States, as well as being the first African-American poet to publish her own book. And another little-known person who played an important role of all this, who was inspired by the revolution, was a lady who went by the name of Mom Bet. And here's her story. Now, I can tell by the looks of this audience that many of you are not familiar with that, and I'm not surprised, but that's okay. And I'll tell you why that's okay a little later on. But Mom Bet was in slavery around Massachusetts. Around 1773, she would hear the street orators while she was in slavery. And while she was in slavery, there was one particular incident where her madam was about to strike her sister with an iron, and instead of sitting back and watching this, she intervened and tried to stop it, and the blow left a terrible scar on her arm. And whenever people would say, "How'd you get that scar?" she would go, "Ask Madam," to show you that she was nobody to play with. Well, anyway, she would go down the streets and she would hear the orators speaking of freedom from England and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal with inalienable rights, etc., and so forth, and the consent of the governed, etc., and so forth. And she started thinking, wait a minute, hold up, something's wrong with this picture. So she went to a lawyer named Sedgwick in Massachusetts and said, "Now, Mr. Sedgwick, I have to ask you a question. Now, I hear all these people talking about freedom and independence and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal, and governments running by the consent of the governed, and so forth. Does that or does that not apply to me?" Well, the lawyer Sedgwick said, you might have a case here. So they went to court, and she sued for her freedom. And the judge ruled that there was nothing in the Declaration of Independence that had an asterisk to say that it did not apply to her because she was black and because she was a woman. So therefore, she was declared free by the state of Massachusetts. And she announced that from then on, she would no longer be Mom Bet. She would be known as Elizabeth Freeman to reflect her new status. And not only that, that act would go on to end slavery in the state of Massachusetts. And state after state in New England and the North would end slavery until New York in 1827. And that was relatively easy for the simple fact that you did not have the plantation system in the North that you did in the South. Many of these people were basically house servants, enslaved people, and so forth. So therefore, there was not a great financial loss. But that act by Mom Bet, or Elizabeth Freeman, led to the freedom of her people in the northern states. Needless to say, as we all know, in the South, that would be a whole lot more difficult over the next century or so. So all of this goes to show that whether you were dealing with the patriots or the loyalists within the black community of America at that time, they were basically all fighting for the same thing that the American troops, no matter what race, were fighting for, and that was for their freedom and of their independence. And another thing that I hope that this story gets across to this audience today is the following idea, something that I tell to my students all the time, and that is this. The more you learn, there is to learn. Thank you. Yeah, I'll take questions. Yes, sir.
Hold on here.
Okay.
I interviewed a gentleman for History Man podcast. I interviewed